So Rush Limbaugh's in some hot water over some things he said on his radio show about Sandra Fluke, the Georgetown University law student who testified before members of Congress about the Obama administration's contraception mandate. Rush called her a slut, he called her a prostitute, he accused her of wanting taxpayers to subsidize her sex life, and even suggested that maybe she could make a sex tape and post it on the internet so all of us who are supposedly funding her sexual escapades can get something out of it by at least we get to see her have the sex. Rather telling suggestion from Rush, I think, there, wouldn't you say? So Rush is, as of the time that I'm recording this, on Tuesday night, March the 6th, Rush has lost 33 sponsors from his radio show. I have not been among those calling for Rush's head on this. I'm of the opinion that the best thing we can do for our society as a whole is to just let people like Rush talk. And especially when he says something just awful like this that gets the attention of people outside of his cocoon, of his regular audience who will just sort of reify everything he says. When he says something that gets everybody's attention, the best thing to do is just let him talk. Let him keep talking. Let everybody see what a hateful, mean-spirited, and occasionally quite stupid hypocrite that Rush Limbaugh is. Just let us all see. Let everybody find out exactly. But now that everybody's paying attention, just let the motherfucker talk. Like most people who are bigoted and small-minded, like Rush is, and I say that not because of something that the liberal media has told me about him, but because I listened to his radio show and used to listen to it regularly for many years. People who are as small-minded as Rush are always the best people to make the case against themselves. And all they have to do to make that case is just keep talking, because it happens all by itself. So Rush himself and what he said about Sandra Fluke aren't really going to be the subject of this video. I'm more interested in attempts by Rush and by some of his flack catchers on the right, like his fellow talk show hosts like Mark Levin or Sean Hannity or some Fox News personalities, other voices and pundits from the right. Their attempts to try to draw equivalencies between what Rush did and something that someone on the liberal side did. And the most common target the last few days has been Bill Maher. Bill Maher recently donated $1 million to a left-wing super PAC that will be supporting President Obama in the general election. And Rush and Mark Levin and a few other Republican-leaning conservative commentators have said, well, you know, if President Obama had any integrity at all, why, he would give back or ask the super PAC to give back the $1 million donation from Bill Maher, because Bill Maher has said some things about Sarah Palin that are way worse than what Rush Limbaugh said about Sandra Fluke. And I mean, Rush just called her a slut and a prostitute. Bill Maher said just horrible things about Sarah Palin, and trying to draw a parallel, an analogy between what Rush said about Sandra Fluke and what Bill Maher said about Sarah Palin. And I just don't see that. I don't see any comparison between, first of all, between Rush Limbaugh and Bill Maher. They're completely different people doing completely different jobs. And second of all, between Sarah Palin and Sandra Fluke. So let me take these one at a time. First of all, what is the difference between Rush Limbaugh and Bill Maher? Well, Bill Maher is a comedian. And Bill Maher, as a comedian, and as a pretty good stand-up comedian, I have to say, is aware of things like irony, like commentary, like using humor and using off-color humor and provocative language as a way of commenting on people's attitudes, including attitudes of people in his audience and even of himself. He operates at a much more sophisticated level than Rush Limbaugh ever has. Rush Limbaugh, like most personalities on the right, has no sense of humor at all. And again, I say this not because I've heard other people say this. I listened to Rush's show for years, regularly, and I still listen to it occasionally. I make an effort to listen to conservative talk radio, so I don't get my talking points about conservative media personalities from liberal websites. They're from me. It's because I listen to this shit, and I know what they're saying, and I know what type of people they are when they're on the radio. I know that Rush Limbaugh has a god-awful sense of humor. He has the sense of humor of an 8th grade bully. He has a really mean-spirited, self-centered sense of humor. He's incapable of self-deprecation. He's incapable of self-reflection or of making any sort of commentary or any sort of meaningful, insightful comment about himself or his own opinions or his own behavior. And or those of his audience, of his conservative throng that tune into him every day, his 20 million strong audience, supposedly. Incapable of challenging those people or of offering any sort of insight into those people, to themselves or to people outside of that group. That's the sort of thing that Bill Maher, at his best, I'm not saying every single word that comes out of his mouth is like a nugget of gold, but that's the sort of thing that Bill Maher does at his best, and that's what the sort of thing he aspires to do. So no equivalent from Rush Limbaugh to Bill Maher at all. The second thing, and the most important thing, and to me the most troubling thing, no comparison at all between Sandra Fluke and Sarah Palin. Let's keep in mind who Sarah Palin is. A woman who was a candidate for the second highest office in the United States less than 4 years ago. She was on the Republican ticket as the vice presidential candidate. And just to take one example, she was unable in an interview with Katie Couric, hardly Edward R. Murrow, to respond coherently to a question about what she liked to read. It wasn't like she was asked to spell the name of the Prime Minister of Kyrgyzstan. She was asked, what newspapers do you read? And this was treated by her champions on the right as a gotcha question. I think she said, so I read them all. You know, she made some bullshit, dumbass answer. And of course she was attacked for it. Of course she was savaged for it. Now, is Sarah Palin being on the ticket of the Republican Party for vice president and being a fucking idiot a crime? No, not at all. Is it worthy of mockery? I think yes, absolutely. I think that's absolutely fair game to point out that you think the person running for vice president is a complete idiot. I think that's completely fair. Is it nice? It's not nice. Does it occasionally cross the line into being mean-spirited? Sure, of course. But is it a fair target? Absolutely. Absolutely. A person running for vice president of the United States that can't answer simple, basic personality quiz questions? Now let's compare Sarah Palin to Sandra Fluke. Who is Sandra Fluke? She is a college student, a private citizen, not running for anything, not holding any power over anyone, never been a governor of a state, never been a major political figure at all, doesn't aspire to be one, so far as I know. What does she do? She testifies before members of Congress about what she sees as a very important issue, the availability of birth control to people through the proposed Health and Human Services mandate from the Obama administration that would require employee health insurance to include coverage for contraception in the policy. That's what she did. That was what she did to warrant a 3-day assault by Rush Limbaugh. He talked about her on his radio show for 3 days. And what did she do to deserve that? She testified before Congress about something that was important to her. Do you see a comparison between Sandra Fluke and Sarah Palin there? Do you see how they are at all equivalent? Because I don't. And the fact that Rush Limbaugh would consider them equivalent, would try to actually make the case that they are equivalent, and that what he said about Sandra Fluke is analogous to what Bill Maher and others have said about Sarah Palin, proves my first point, that there is no comparison between Limbaugh and Bill Maher. They're doing completely different jobs, and they're operating on completely different levels. If Rush Limbaugh is so dense and stupid, or thinks that his audience is so dense and stupid that they will buy that what he's doing to Sandra Fluke is the same as what Bill Maher does to Sarah Palin. That, to me, is confirmation of my first point, that he and Bill Maher are nothing alike. They're not the same thing at all. Now let me touch on the real reason why I'm even making this video, because I wasn't even going to do a standalone video about the Limbaugh thing. I was going to fold it into the next edition of 5 Stupid Things, which I'm still going to say something about it, but I hadn't planned on making a special video about it until I was listening to the Mark Levin show on Tuesday night, the night I'm taping this, and I heard him start talking about Louis C.K. in connection to this Rush Limbaugh thing. He moved off of Bill Maher as his target for right-wing outrage, and he moved to Louis C.K. He played a clip of Louis C.K. on the Opie and Anthony show from a few years ago when they were talking with him about Sarah Palin, and Louis C.K. said he said he hated Sarah Palin more than most people, and he joked about how he thought it was bullshit that she was giving speeches about how difficult it is to raise a special needs child, when at the time her special needs child was less than a year old, which according to Louis C.K. meant that you can't even tell that the child is special needs at that point. It's just a baby. And he said, just wait until the child is 15 years old and still acting the way it acted when it was a baby. Then you'll be able to complain about how difficult it is to raise a special needs child. Then you'll be able to wax poetic about the unique challenges of raising a child with Down syndrome in the case of Sarah Palin's child. And he called her a cunt, and he said that he made a reference to her retard making cunt or something like that. And I think that shit is funny. I'm sorry. I have a sick sense of humor, and I think that shit is funny. And not only is it funny in a very visceral, just sort of immature way, just to hear him say these really mean things about Sarah Palin, he's making a point. He's making a very important, very intelligent observation about what Sarah Palin is doing when she brings up her status as a special needs parent and what it actually means. There's a level underneath the surface where, yes, of course, he's saying things that are funny and making you laugh, but he's also getting at a point. And Mark Levin played that on his show tonight, a clip of Louis C.K. on Opie and Anthony, and was just appalled and talked about how awful it was, and he'd never heard anything like it, and why aren't people just demanding that Louis C.K. be boycotted. And he mentioned that Louis C.K. is going to be the headliner at the Correspondents' Dinner this year, which I didn't know until Mark Levin said that, and I think that's awesome. Louis C.K. is going to be the headliner at the Correspondents' Dinner this year. That's going to be awesome. So he says he's never even heard of Louis C.K., and he's never heard anything like what he said on Opie and Anthony. It's just disgusting. Well, as it happens, I happen to know that Mark Levin has heard of Louis C.K. In fact, he's played a bit from Louis C.K. on his show. I was listening to the show that day because, as I said, I listened to talk radio. And before I sat down in front of the camera just now, I looked it up just to make sure you wouldn't know I was just pulling this out of my ass. On Mark Levin's radio show on February 13th, 2009, he played the audio from Louis C.K.'s recent appearance on Conan O'Brien's show, where Louis C.K., during the course of their interview, did his bit from his stand-up act, Everything's Amazing and Nobody's Happy. And then Mark Levin, responding to that bit, said this, quote, "There was a great segment on the Conan O'Brien show back in December. Our hat tip to the National Review's The Corner. We've talked about this before, the wonderful things we have access to that makes our lives better, and yet we complain about it all the time. One of the reasons is the left wants you unhappy all the time. While what he's saying is very funny, it's very true. This comedian said it very, very well. We have to cut through the non-stop negative attacks on this society that we hear from the liberal media and the liberal politician. We have to cherish our freedom and all that it provides us, because if we didn't have it, what a disaster that would be." Never mind the fact that these great insights that Mark Levin is touting were made by a member of the left. Louis C.K. is a liberal. He could be described as nothing else if you listen to his material and you watch his FX show and you listen to him talk about things in interviews. Louis C.K., who made these great insights, according to Mark Levin, about the nature of our society and the need to cut through negativity, a liberal made those points. And not only that, a liberal stand-up comedian who Mark Levin has clearly heard of because he played his audio on his radio show 3 years ago. And now all of a sudden, he's never heard of Louis C.K. Now, It's possible he doesn't remember this brilliant bit that he played on his radio show, or it's also possible that he's just a fucking liar, and I think those two possibilities are equally likely. In fact, I think it's probably more likely that you're a liar, Mark, because I've listened to your show enough to get that impression of you. I think maybe you just honestly forgot that you played a bit from Louis C.K., the guy you'd never heard of, on your show 3 years ago. Or maybe you do remember and you don't care and you're just a fucking liar. Like I said about Bill Maher, only even more so in the case of Louis C.K., who is a fucking genius. Uses his material, his comedy, to comment on himself and on us in a way that Rush Limbaugh could never even hope to approach. Rush Limbaugh is a hack, and Louis C.K. is an artist. Like a real no-fooling artist. Like a really sharp, shrewd, intelligent, thoughtful artist. And for Mark Levin to not only pretend that he's never heard of the guy, even though he has, and I'll put the link, the Louis C.K. bit that Mark Levin played on the show is still linked on Mark Levin's website. There's a screen grab of it right there in case he decides to take it down. That's where it is, and I'll show you in the description bar. I'll put a link to where it is, so you can go and look at it yourself. For Mark Levin to pretend that he's never heard of the guy and to try and draw some equivalency between Louis C.K. making fun of Sarah Palin and Rush Limbaugh just saying mean, denigrating things about a woman whose only offense was testifying before Congress about contraception is just complete and utter horseshit. And it certainly doesn't make me think of Louis C.K. or Bill Maher or people like them as assholes for making fun of poor little Sarah Palin. What it does is it only reinforces for me what huge and utterly shameless assholes Rush Limbaugh and Mark Levin and people like them are for denigrating Sandra Fluke, who did nothing wrong and nothing deserving of mockery, and then when they catch shit for it, trying to justify it by comparing themselves to Bill Maher and Louis C.K. It's ridiculous. It's complete horseshit. And if Rush Limbaugh and Mark Levin and the rest think that that stands up for even a second, then they're even dumber than they think their audience is.